Hello and welcome wherever you are in the world. I am Humphrey Hawksley, your host for this timely Democracy Forum debate on an issue which continues to reverberate as it has done for decades. A nation pivotal to so many global challenges, born out of the violent partition of India, battered by poverty, corruption and weak institutions, a pendulum swinging between military and civilian rule, but with the hand of the military ever present and intervening. The main prism in which much of the outside world sees Pakistan is through protest, war, and terrorism. Why is that? Why can't Pakistan move on? And why now cannot a legendary cricketer turned political leader serve out his full term in office without chaos, turbulence, and of course, the military? Our Democracy Forum debate, Repercussions of Pakistan's Descent into Anarchy. To unpack the issues, we have a superb and insightful panel. Pervez Hoodbhoy, Harlan Ullman, Sumrin Kalia, Saeed Badrul Ahsan, Tim Willasey-Wilsey. We have had, as you might notice, a change of panelists in that MJ Akbar has suddenly been called away, and Niloufer Siddiqui, who was going to join us from Albany State University, has been taken ill. We wish her a speedy recovery. The Democracy Forum chair, Barry Gardiner, is hearing the arguments throughout and will sum up with his thoughts at the end. And as always, to give us the background to our debate, we go to the president of the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce. Lord Bruce, lay out our canvas.
Good afternoon. As president of the Democracy Forum, I'd like to welcome you today to the webinar, which we've convened to discuss the consequences of Pakistan's growing political crisis. For those of you who follow our webinars or read our sister magazine, Asian Affairs, Pakistan's failure to develop as a functioning democracy is a regular feature of our panelists' scrutiny. So I'm very grateful to the team at TDF for inviting such an eminent group of speakers to participate in the seminar this afternoon to address this issue. And I thank them all for agreeing to take part. And on your behalf, I'd like to thank Humphrey Hawksley for agreeing to moderate the session today. Pakistan is scheduled to hold an election for its National Assembly by October, but amidst a deteriorating political and economic situation, many commentators believe it is very unlikely to be free and fair, further attenuating the already fragile nature of democracy. Taking office in April last year, the incumbent government, the Pakistan Democratic Movement, a ruling coalition of two parties and other partners, led by Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, has become increasingly unpopular and has been forced to make unpalatable fiscal reforms as a consequence of reviving a stalled IMF program. The resulting cost of living crisis has given the opposition PTI party, led by Imran Khan, a chance to revive its fortunes through the forthcoming election. But on the 9th of May, Imran Khan was detained on corruption charges by paramilitary troops of the National Accountability Bureau, the NAB, while attending a court hearing in Islamabad. His arrest led to civil disturbances in Punjab and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where several people were killed in violent clashes that followed, and several hundred were injured. 2 days later, however, Pakistan's Supreme Court overruled the arrest and ordered Khan's release. The Chief Justice, Umar Atta Bandial, declared that the NAB had acted illegally and their actions had a chilling effect. But the government was quick to condemn the decision of the Chief Justice and let it be known that Khan would be arrested again. In Lahore, in response to the arrest, a crowd vandalized and looted the private residence of the Corps commander, Lieutenant General Salman Fayaz Ghani, and smashed the gates of the army headquarters in Rawalpindi. On the 25th of May, however, a further crackdown resulted in the arrest of thousands of PTI party members, while pressure was applied to Khan's political allies to quit politics. Khan, who believes that Pakistan, I quote, has begun a descent into fascism, claimed that the state is trying to dismantle the party. Indeed, over the course of the last few weeks, there has been an exodus of his senior political allies, including a former chief minister, 4 other former cabinet ministers, and dozens of other federal and state ministers, who all stepped down from senior posts or left the PTI altogether. And many who have not demitted office are now behind bars. At the very heart of this political crisis lies the deep personal enmity between General Asim Munir, Chief of the Army Staff, and Imran Khan. Their feud dates from June 2019, when Munir was sacked by Khan as Director General of Inter-Services Intelligence. Indeed, I quote, Khan's challenge to a man that few Pakistanis have previously dared openly criticize risks sparking the most serious confrontation between civilian politicians and the military since the nation's return to democracy in 2008, states the Financial Times. Bilal Gilani, executive director of the pollster Gallup Pakistan, further observes, I quote, Pakistan's future is likely to be decided not by elections or public opinion, but by who wins the power battle between the military and Imran Khan. One side has the ability to bring the public out, the other has the ability to bring the arms out, he writes. We've just seen the first round. There'll be more rounds of violence before everything settles. Political analysts believe indisputably that the military has orchestrated Khan's recent arrest and the detention of his party members. He could be tried under anti-terrorism or martial laws for the cases lodged against him, and were he to be convicted, he would be disqualified from running for office. This dramatic crackdown, I quote, is a clear strategy by the military to break down all the support structures that Khan has, says Avanish Paliwal, Associate Professor in International Relations at SOAS in London. Once these structures are gone, Khan is next in line. And interviewed on the 18th of April as the crisis unfolded, the political historian Ahmed Rashid, whose book Pakistan on the Brink, Descent into Chaos has been recently published, suggested that Pakistan faces 3 major challenges concurrently, which appear to have no solution in sight. First, the principal institutions of state, the judiciary, parliament, and the military are at war with each other. Second, the security of its international border with Afghanistan is threatened by rampant terrorism. And third, the economy is in dire straits, with inflation now running at 37% and likely to rise further, while the country's external public debt and liabilities now exceed $126 billion, of which 20% is owed to Chinese lenders, thus creating considerable repayment and debt servicing pressure. Over the next 3 years, the country needs to repay $77.5 billion. This is the worst crisis since 1971, claims Rashid. And publishing a guide to the likely outcome for Pakistan's next general election, the Economist Intelligence Unit suggests there is a 70% probability that the PDM coalition under Shehbaz Sharif will retain power, but qualifies its prediction by emphasizing that, I quote, the post-election political dispensation will depend heavily on the military's continuing support. Conversely, a PTI victory, although only a 20% probability, may come about if the Supreme Court's Chief Justice, who is viewed as sympathetic to Mr. Khan, does not convict the former Prime Minister in the judicial cases launched against him, declares the national election to have been rigged, and mandates a fresh election. And commenting on the confused nature of this constitutional conundrum, a distinguished former Pakistan ambassador to the United States and the United Kingdom, who also served as her country's representative to the United Nations. Malia Lodi warns that Islamabad is, I quote, now in uncharted territory with a high degree of unpredictability. The traditional means of crisis management and ensuring political outcomes may not work. As a result of political brinkmanship, the situation can spin out of everyone's control and drive the country to the edge of implosion. Well, thank you very much for deciding to watch our webinar this afternoon, and I hope you enjoy the proceedings.
Thank you, Lord Bruce. Unpredictability and uncharted territory. What are the repercussions? Our first speaker is Dr. Pervez Hoodbhoy, nuclear physicist, writer and activist, who in one of his latest columns for Dawn wrote that Imran Khan was paying the price for his hubris and arrogance. But this is no occasion for rejoicing. What does he mean by that? Pervez Hoodbhoy, give us your argument.
Thank you very much, Humphrey. Imran Khan was a man who believed that destiny would put him as Prime Minister of Pakistan, and he rose to power on the shoulders of the army. There is actually very little doubt about that. He was a cricketer, a man who had set up a cancer hospital, but he was a novice initially before entering politics. The army, seeing that this was a man who shared their values meaning that of Islam. Imran Khan had long been a supporter of the Taliban and in fact had become known as Taliban Khan. Further, he was anti-Indian, and he was very much involved with the Punjabi establishment, with the Punjabi intelligentsia. And so this made him the ideal candidate, and so we had the army clearly supporting his dharna in Islamabad back in 2013 and then 2017 again, and we had in fact videos of the Director General of the Rangers handing out 1,000 rupee notes to the protesters who had laid siege on Islamabad. So that was what brought him into power. But his 3.5 years in power was a very rough ride because of severe mismanagement, and it was manifest in many different ways. First of all, those he had surrounded himself with were what are known as electables, those who had somehow managed to win elections because they were local power brokers, but they had used their influence to enrich themselves, and this became very clear to the public. Moreover, he had no idea of how to deal with many of the very complex issues, including that of how to deal with the Americans and with the Europeans even more. When the religious fanatics in this country, the TLP, the tehreek-e-insaf, Pakistan, demanded that Pakistan sever relations with France after the incident of blasphemy in France. Imran Khan agreed to that and saw the TLP, hosted the TLP leaders in his office, and it was a very difficult situation. When Kabul fell to the Taliban, Imran Khan immediately announced that the Afghans had broken the chains of slavery, and he lauded that. But this was very embarrassing to the Pakistan army, which even today receives a substantial fraction of its supplies from the United States, particularly advanced weaponry such as the F-16 and spare parts for that. And now it was a difficult situation because the U.S. had pulled out, and the economy was clearly on the way down. So multiple instances of misgovernance eventually led to the army to start revising its opinion, but things came to a head when and insisted that his own choice of general be made the
have we lost Pervez Hoodbhoy there?
To his
Pervez Hoodbhoy, you are cutting in and out. Let's give you another few seconds. And he is now gone. I think that Dr. Hoodbhoy is talking to us from Lahore, whereby the internet connection would not have been so good. He was talking there in a way about the naivety and innocence of Imran Khan on dealing with the army, the Americans, the Taliban, the whole raft of political challenges that a politician has. Yet having said that, are you back with us, Pervez?
Yes, I hope so. I can see you.
Okay. Well, but had you finished your argument, or were you finishing it, and we could try and get a couple of questions in?
Let me just conclude by saying that the title of this seminar would have been very appropriate 6 weeks ago, when Pakistan was in fact plunging headlong into a crisis. But now it seems that things have stabilized to the point where its life is as usual, but ahead lies the possibility, in fact, the certainty of default, because this is an economy that's run out of steam, and it's only a question of weeks, maybe of a few months, before the economy descends into absolute catastrophe. And that, I think, is going to make a future seminar of yours very relevant, because by then we will have indeed reached, I won't say the bottom, but we shall have reached an inflection point.
I'd just like to, whilst we've got the line up, just to go a little bit deeper on one of the things you said life is pretty much back to normal now. What is that you've got a former prime minister in jail or being charged with all sorts of things, facing jail? You've got the army back in charge. You've got no real vision for the country apart from this back and forth. Is it right to call that normal?
I would call it a normal state of crisis. But things had got extremely unstable. In fact, you couldn't travel from one part of Islamabad to the other because of these protests. And it wasn't that these protests had suddenly popped up. One had been seeing that for months at an end, because Imran Khan, once out of power, had managed to rally a considerable amount of support for him. And then he came out swinging against the army. But let's get this very clear. He was not attacking the army because of its arrogation of wealth and power to itself. He was not attacking the army because it has made India its perpetual enemy. He was not attacking the army because it had put the Afghan Taliban in power. What he was attacking the army for was that it had withdrawn its support for him. And so that, unfortunately, has been misunderstood by a lot of people, by a lot of his supporters, who think that he is now a knight in shining armor who has taken on the most powerful institution in the country. He has, but for the wrong reason.
Okay,
he has.
there's a question that's come in here that sort of feeds into that from Anand Singh Tomar. Are the events of May the 9th a sign that the civil-military imbalance is changing? And can the army regain its former hold over its people, given the failed policies it has presided over? Can it regain the trust of the people?
It will not have the trust of the people. I don't even know if it fully had that trust. But in the short term, the army is a stabilizing force. However, life cannot continue as normal because Pakistan is on a war economy. Economy is now running out of fuel.
You talk about back to normal and the army being a stabilizing force. Has this not been the argument practically ever since Pakistan was created, or certainly since 1971, that because it is a stabilizing force, it cannot move on to become a full democracy?
That's absolutely correct. The army has entrenched itself as an institution with vast business interests. It has to have a state of perpetual enmity with India, because without that, there's no reason to sustain such a large army. And so it would very much like life to continue on as usual. It would like the war economy to be perpetual. However, now Pakistan has run out of options, and so we are seriously at a tipping point. It cannot continue the way that it wants to, simply because of economic reasons. There's been no change of heart.
And just before I let you go, give us, in a nutshell, the repercussions of what is happening right now.
Well, I think that Imran Khan is going to be disbarred from politics. I think that the PDM government is going to continue. The impact of that will be that, sure, they'll be in power for another few months, maybe a year, but by that time, inflation and the economy, they will have caused things to crash. And so we will be back in a state of crisis very soon.
Pervez Hoodbhoy, thank you very much. Stay with us if you can, if your line doesn't go down, because the debate is just getting underway, because we're going from this state of crisis where you are in Lahore to Washington, D.C. with Dr. Harlan Ullman of the Atlantic Council and chair of the Kiloween Political Advisory Group. He was an advisor to the late Benazir Bhutto and to her husband, President Asif Zardari, as he attempted to govern what was becoming an increasingly ungovernable state. His argument is that a decade ago, Pakistan was on the brink of disaster, but they might have been the best days it's had. What is it now? Harlan Ullman, the floor is yours.
Humphrey, thank you. And I agree with Lord Bruce's introduction that really provided the right context. Sometimes my signal is fading in and out, and so if it does, I'll be back in 30 or so seconds. Let me give an analogy going back to just before World War I broke out in the summer of 1914. The situation then was viewed from Paris and the Quai d'Orsay as serious and not yet desperate. But in Germany, in the Reichstag, the view was that the situation was desperate but not fully serious. I think that's the situation in Pakistan, and let me explain what has happened. During my experience with Pakistan, there were a number of really seminal events that really tested the United States relationship and led to the United States really regarding Pakistan more as an enemy than a friend. Assassinations were ripe. Benazir Bhutto was assassinated. My close friend Salman Taseer was assassinated, representing the issues of terrorism that have not gotten any better. We were tested then by the raid on Islamabad in 2011. And of course, the Ray Davis situation when he gunned down a number of Pakistanis in Lahore that forced another crisis. I was engaged obliquely with the resignation of President Musharraf in order that President Zardari would be able to take over. And so the conditions then were really quite unstable and not very healthy. And indeed, there was a great competition between PPP and PMLN. and Nawaz Sharif. Now, if you compare the situation then to today, I think it's taken a turn for the worse. PPP is less relevant, even though I think that Shahbaz Sharif is a competent manager. And remember, he was a very good governor of, I should say, provincial manager of Punjab. He still is very much in the shadow of his older brother, Nawaz, which is very unfortunate. The Americans, especially since the evacuation from Kabul, do not see getting engaged again with Pakistan worthwhile. And so now you have this political turmoil. You have no clear-cut way of anybody who's going to be able to impose some kind of rule. You still have a feudal system that's controlled by a few families. And then, of course, you have the whole Imran Khan debacle. Also during that period, you may remember that the Pakistani ambassador to the United States, Hussain Haqqani, was accused of treason and summoned back, where only by a miraculous intervention by the United States was he cleared of charges that were clearly falsely imposed on him. And so what's happened over time is this absence of government, this continuation of a feudal system, the failure, unlike in Bangladesh, for Pakistan to be able to motivate or mobilize its economy. And the fact is that the army, certainly under Kiani, learned its lesson then, that it really didn't want to impose itself on the government because it understood that governing was far, far too difficult and really exceeded the capabilities of the army to do so. Now, today, I think politically it's clear that Pakistan is in absolute crisis. I agree that it looks like that Imran Khan is going to be banned from politics. And so now you have PMLN under Shahbaz, but obviously with his older brother having a controlling interest, PPP, which is less relevant. The country is in financial chaos. The loans and debts that it needs to repay are going to be increasingly difficult, and the economy is not working. So what results from this? And you have a country in chaos. You really don't have any outside forces necessarily that are going to be in support of Pakistan. After all, the United States is now much more interested in India with the so-called Quad, with it, Japan and Australia. China may intervene somewhat, but China is interested beyond Pakistan. And so I do not see any real solutions that are going to improve the situation. Now, one area where I'm less concerned than many is the security of Pakistani nuclear weapons. In many ways, Pakistani nuclear weapons, believe it or not, are more secure given the history than American weapons. But this is going to reemerge as an issue. How the United States is going to deal with this is probably unclear, but I don't think the United States is prepared to intervene. And so, as prior speakers have said, this descent into chaos is no longer a descent. Pakistan is in chaos. I don't see any way of working this out over time. And so Pakistan could easily become one of the hotspots that could exceed even the tensions over Taiwan, could exceed what's happening in Ukraine if the situation really boils over because of this combination of terrorism, economic chaos, and political inability to roll. So this is a big issue, and unlike other circumstances, when I thought that there were at least solutions, certainly 10 years ago when Zardari was president, I see that we've run out of solutions and we're in a very desperate situation. And quite frankly, I don't see how the outcome can be any better than people are already projecting, in that the situation is dire and it's only likely to become more dire. That is not a very helpful commentary, but it does explain what's happening without any kind of recommendation about how do we reverse direction, because that's going to take a government that can govern. And at this stage, I don't see that happening, certainly for the short term.
As you were saying, was there a government that could govern, or could you see the possibility of it unfolding as it has done now?
There was under Zardari, but in the summer, in Christmas time 2008, we had a meeting in the presidential palace with John Kerry, who was then chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Mahmoud Durrani, who was the national security advisor, retired general. And we laid out a plan that I think would have been comprehensive and very successful. But there was a real problem. And the problem was that Prime Minister Gilani was despised by President Zardari. And in terms of that tension, for whatever reasons, Prime Minister Gilani managed to dismiss General Durrani. And General Durrani, because of his seniority, had some influence over General Kiani. And at that stage, this plan for bringing Pakistan into the fold collapsed. And from that time on, I didn't see anything that was going to replace it. I think we lost a tremendous opportunity then. And I don't see a similar opportunity arising, because I think the Army is going to have no option except to become re-engaged. That's going to heighten tensions further. And when one can only hope that there'll be enough competence in the Army to be able to deal with the economy and, and at least slow down the descent or make the impact a little bit softer than it appears that it's going to be a very, very difficult and hard landing.
Could I then ask you to expand a little bit on two or three elements of the repercussions that you laid out? You said that you're not worried about the nuclear weapons. Explain how they are secured.
Pakistan, believe it or not, has a three-key system. Durrani actually, in a paper that he wrote for Los Alamos many, many years ago, had laid out the three-key system. And back 10 years ago, 12 years ago, the US was profoundly worried about the security of Pakistani nuclear weapons. Could they fall into the hand of terrorists? And interestingly, when I referred this paper to Admiral Mike Mullen, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, even though it was unclassified, the US military had no knowledge of it. But if you go back and review the paper that Durrani wrote, the Pakistani system has three keys. I had a chance to talk with the then director of the nuclear programs. And so I think that their systems are safe right now because the warheads are not mated with the delivery vehicles. But that's going to be a recurring problem. The issue here simply is whether the Army is going to have the competence and the intent and the stomach to step in and try and halt this decline. And whether it has the competence or not to do that remains to be seen. But unfortunately, I see that as the only outcome, Humphrey.
And another issue, of course, is when you have a military regime or a society like that, the economy is collapsing. There's the propensity, as we know, to lash out and create a war somewhere or start a war somewhere. How would that unfold with Pakistan in supporting terrorism?
They don't have the capability to do that. They don't have the capability to do that. They don't want to get into a dust-up with India. They want to maintain a secure border with Afghanistan. And so obviously ISI, the Inter Service Intelligence Agency, has been very, very close to the Taliban forever, or for a very long time. And so I think that the Army wants to minimize any kind of external problems. The last thing they want is to get into a dust-up. What they're going to have to do is to try and deal with a political situation that's untenable, an economy that's disintegrating, and just hope that they'll be able to stitch together enough to keep the country from total disintegration. This is going to be a real test of the Chief of Staff of the Army and ISI and all of its elements. And I just don't know that the United States is interested enough to know what's really going on thoroughly there to see where we can lend a hand. I've been part of a small group here to make the case that we have to get re-engaged with Pakistan, but we're not finding any traction whatsoever for that in the State Department, the Department of Defense, or indeed the White House, which is also very troubling because this is an area that's going to need our attention. But quite frankly, China and Ukraine are taking up all the airspace and all the bandwidth, and you can understand why. One hopes that Secretary of State Tony Blinken's visit with President Xi is trying to put relations back on a better, sounder track. And what's going to happen in Ukraine with the offensive, nobody knows, but those are going to occupy our time, as well as the unfolding presidential elections, which obviously have happened here with the indictments of Donald Trump. And so our attention is not going to be on Pakistan. But I don't think Pakistan has the stomach or any reason to cause some kind of external crisis because they simply couldn't cope with it. And this could be a larger replay of 1971 and President Yahya Khan's idiocy in sending the troops into what was then East Pakistan.
And there's, just before I let you go and move on, there's a couple of questions that you have answered, but I'll say the questions and comment on them. Ajay Pratap Singh Rathore, what is the role of multilateral institutions in brokering peace? You've told us the US isn't interested. Are there any others?
None.
Nadeem Shah, is Pakistan at a turning point or a point of no return?
in between. I think it's closer to a point of no return. This is going to depend upon the role of the army and whether the political parties can deal together. But it's coming awfully close to the point of no return. And there really is no incentive for external powers really to become engaged at this stage, which is also very, very troubling. When the United States was engaged, and it was very, very heavily engaged because of the war in Afghanistan, I don't see any kind of righting moment from external forces that's going to be able to put Pakistan, I won't say back together, but certainly change the course so it's not in such a very delicate and difficult position. But I'm not optimistic.
So Pakistan's on its own, which brings us, thank you, Harlan Ullman, very much for that. Please stay with us because we're going to have a back and forth as we go on. Dr. Sumrin Kalia from the Institute of Global Prosperity at University College London is a specialist in the way that Islamist movements strengthen and weaken civil society. She is going to share with us the role Pakistan's civil society can play in the current crisis, because as we've just heard, Pakistan is pretty much on its own in this one. Sumrin Kalia, give us your thoughts.
Am I audible? Hi.
Hi.
I'm also in Karachi, so my internet is a little bit unstable too, but I'll go on. Well, at the moment, I'm in Karachi and the life seems pretty normal, as Pervez said. And I think this is because of the Pakistan's civil society. And this is something we need to remember, that Pakistan's civil society has been quite a vibrant one. And it has been able to come up and talk and protest in the cases when it really needed. In the case of Ayub Khan in the 60s, there were huge protests. In 1977 against Bhutto as well, there were protests. And then the lawyers' movement against Musharraf. So we do have a very vibrant civil society, and these groups are capable of being democratic. Why are they not coming out right now? This is because it's Imran Khan. They are not coming out in support for Imran Khan because Imran Khan did not really invest in building grassroots democracy. His politics was mainly a theatrics, and he did not invest in building organizational networks. And basically, this is particularly the reason why at the moment we don't see such kind of resistance coming up. And the reason why Pakistan has managed to survive through different levels of crisis is because of its civil society. In COVID, we have seen the role of different NGOs, including Islamic NGOs, in providing support. So while we keep stressing that Islam is a kind of only useful for terrorism, that's really not the way it is. It has really been able to provide grassroots support to people, organizations which are driven by the agenda of service. And they are hugely condemning terrorism. And in the same way, they're also providing support to democracy in different ways. At the moment, I'm from Karachi. We just had an election, and PPP won the elections, the local government elections, although Jamaat-e-Islami had much more support, and the people from Jamaat-e-Islami were jailed inside by the PPP and the current military civilian regime, the hybrid regime, but I wouldn't really call it even a hybrid regime. It's more of a disguised regime. So the thing is that there is a problem of the state, which has not been able to really connect down to the level of the people. And the real problem then is because when people are not heard, then they listen to these kind of populist voices like Imran Khan, and may also go into radicalism because the state does not respond. And I believe there are three things that there can be still done to improve and find a way out. And I have confidence in Pakistan's civil society's ability to move out. The first thing is that we need definitely economic reforms to enable people to be able to engage within their local networks and find solutions within their neighborhood at the neighborhood level. And this has been demonstrated earlier as well. as during COVID I mentioned. And the second is, I guess, the leaders must develop some level of democratic civility, which seems to be completely absent. And this is also something that we need to remember, that Pakistanis don't support violent extremism. I'm from Karachi, and MQM is an example. It was led by an ethnic populist leader, and it had a lot of support for a very long time. But then as soon as the party became violent, people did withdraw their support from the party. And yes, there are still some people which support MQM, but this is also because MQM delivered and has eventually been turning less violent over time. But now the way, as it has already been mentioned, that the way things work, the democratic voices are continuously suppressed, and it is one of the reasons why we don't see Pakistan really marching towards democracy. The reason why military continues to be able to have a control over the country is because of the fact that there are certain things that the military has done which enable it to reach the people. I'll give you the example of the Local Government Act, which was passed during Musharraf's time in 2001. During that time, because of the fact that the power was devolved from the top, from the center to the local governments, and although this was not a full devolution of power, it was not fiscal, it was partly political. And despite that, during the 10 years of Musharraf, the Human Development Index rose by 18.9% from 2000 to 2007 at the time when this Local Government Act was in effect. And this corresponds to an average of 2.7%. But then since 2010, it has gone up only by 0.68%, which is very low. So you can imagine that it's not a problem only of terrorism or Islamism or politicians. Yes, there are politicians who have not delivered, but there are also certain politicians who have delivered, and also certain levels of right policy making that has supported Pakistan in many ways. And it is a matter of political will at the moment, and which I find at the moment very much missing. The current PDM has become a toy in the hands of the military. Nawaz Sharif has been abandoned. Benazir is out of the country. There is no, but Benazir is not there anymore, unfortunately. So we don't have a real proper opposition against the regime right now. And it is important that the opposition can be built from the grassroots. And for that, not just the people must be enabled to build networks, but also the state must do the right things. And the first right thing would be to hold elections and then empower that government to further empower the lower tiers of the government. That's all that I have to say.
Thank you very much. I have to almost come up on that last thought, but I noted a few things you said. You said in Karachi, where you are at the moment, it is normal. And you said at the moment a lot. And then you said hold elections and empower the winner usually. But does Pakistan have the institutions that can do that? That's failed over many, many, many decades.
During the Musharraf's time, the local government did make the citizen community boards. They were not as effective, but the Pakistani people have the ability to access the local institutions. So yes, I mean, we do have a very overly developed bureaucracy, which I would say, whether it's the military bureaucracy, whether it's the civil bureaucracy. It is not the absence of institutions, but it's more the will that is absent.
Okay. And how does the army work with these civil society groups? Do they work in opposition to each other? Do they work together on certain issues and projects?
It depends on what kind of civil society activists are we talking about. The one that come from like the Islamist groups, the right-wing Islamists, not necessarily, I mean, I think you need to use the word Islamism with a caution because it's usually taken always in a negative tone, but they do have a agenda of forging Islam, but they still work on the ground. So yes, they work hand in hand with Pakistani military. There are other groups as well, like the women's groups as well, which have, access to the military. They have not been able to get the support, but other, opposition groups like PTM and others, they don't get along. So I would say that it is quite a vibrant and a very rich and also contested civil society, which is a sign of a democracy, I would say. Yes, it is receding. The freedoms are receding, and it has this recession has been very, very fast since April. And unfortunately, people have not come out because Imran Khan was not able to mobilize the people the way he could have because of his immense popularity. But that's one of the reasons we don't see progress happening in it.
I see. Because in many Asian countries, I'm thinking particularly places that I've covered, say in Indonesia, where you do have, Islamist civil society groups that do great help to the local communities without seeming to threaten the local politicians. So it's sort of a growing thing. And others, particularly in Taiwan and South Korea, where civil society groups have been allowed to grow in order to create a democratic, accountable society and government. Any of that happening in Pakistan?
Well, there are a lot of Islamic NGOs which don't, have an oppositional role towards the state, but there are, of course, many others which do, such as, the, extreme right-wing ones, the TLP, although it is usually said, and it is true, that TLP was one of the, it was bolstered by the military. But my whole research, my whole PhD thesis was on Barelvi Islamism. And from what I saw, that although they are extremists, they were resisting against the military too. And there was a voice within them because they were, of course, I mean, we can use the word indoctrinated here at the moment for this kind of group, right? But they were resisting. And this, again, is a sign of that, in a democracy, if people are able to speak up and have political representations. This is really different from the Taliban because the Taliban did not contest elections. They did not form the political party. TLP is still a political party. It's just like the right-wing populist radical right parties in Europe, and that we need to be able to deal with them. And they are in a confrontational way, not in a correct way. Their agendas may not be correct, but that still is like an opposition stance.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. I'd just like to wrap up your contribution here, although I want you to stay on for the thing later on, is Prashant Kumar says, can the current crisis be the impetus needed for future political stability? Can we hone that question towards civil society? Can they be the solution?
I think they are the only solution. Okay. You don't see any will from the political leaders. We don't see any institutional effectiveness at the moment. The international community, as just mentioned by Harlem, is just unwilling. It's not willing to participate. So the only solution right now is Pakistan civil society.
And the solution is not the army?
No.
Okay.
The army is not going to be helping Pakistan. I mean, I'll be glad if they do manage to secure the nuclear weapons, but they are not going to be able to put the army through. We need to learn from some right policies, right?
Yeah. Okay,
that's devolution.
That is very clear. There is a thought that the army can be the solution in the short term, but definitely not in the long term. Thank you so much for that. Saeed Badrul Ahsan, our next speaker, is a Bangladeshi journalist and columnist contributing to academic institutes around the world. In a recent column, he described Imran Khan as being tactless, but praised him for revealing the truth to Pakistani voters about the army's role and origins in the 1971 war and separation. Saeed Badrul Ahsan, put all that in perspective for us and take the debate further.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hawksley. Well, I did mention Imran Khan's comment recently, a few weeks ago, on one of those video speeches that he regularly makes. He raised the question in Urdu, of course, what happened in 1971, and then he went on to inform his audience that in 1971 the army did not accept, in fact, repudiated the results of a general election, as a result of which a crisis developed and Pakistan got broken into two. But I must also add here that Dr. Pervez Hoodbhoy, who is with us here, he has also been speaking very clearly about what happened in 1971. I've read his articles and I've heard him speak at different seminars and meetings in different cities in Pakistan. He has been very clear about it. Now, see, the problem, as we see it, as people like myself, we see it where Pakistan is concerned. If you go back to Imran Khan's comment on the election results of 1971 and the ramifications of those elections, it was Pakistan's first general election in nearly 24 years of its existence at that till that point of time, and the country simply got divided. It got broken up, because of certain factors. One was, of course, the immediate factor was the refusal of the minority Pakistan People's Party, led by Mr. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, to attend the National Assembly session, because they did not agree. Mr. Bhutto wanted some accommodation, some agreement with Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, the leader of the majority party, before he could attend the session. One thing led to another, and earlier, before this crisis developed in 1971, General Yahya Khan, the second military ruler in Pakistan's history, he had traveled to Dhaka after the election, and on his way back to Karachi, on his way back to Rawalpindi by way of Karachi, he had told newsmen that Pakistan's economic problems will be inherited by Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, who will take office as Pakistan's next prime minister. That didn't happen, and we know the rest. So this is when we talk of elections in Pakistan. See, this 1971 crisis comes to mind. But let's also note here that elections in Pakistan have been a very unfortunate story. The very first election in Pakistan, that too took place on the provincial level in what was then East Bengal, or later became East Pakistan and today's Bangladesh. It was in 1954 when a combined opposition called the United Front, in Bengali it was called the Jukto Front, in English it was the United Front, which was led by such politicians, leading political figures as Mr. Hussain Shahid Sorwardi, then A.K. Fazlul Haq and Maulana Bhashani. They routed the Muslim League, which was then in office in office as the provincial government in Dhaka. That election took place in March 1954. Barely 2 months later, in May, the government, the cabinet that was formed, was dismissed by the central government, which was located in Karachi at that time. Islamabad had not yet come up. So this was the beginning of Pakistan's unfortunate journey as far as elections were concerned. And then we had, of course, it was expected that with the adoption of Pakistan's first constitution in 1956. Imagine, say, 9 years after Pakistan's creation, it took 9 years for a constitution to be framed, to be formulated and adopted by the Constituent Assembly in 1956. But that constitution didn't survive more than 2 years. In 1958, martial law was imposed on the country by the president at that time, Major General Iskandar Mirza, and the army chief, General Ayub Khan. Of course, Ayub Khan, within 20 days of the declaration of martial law, overthrew or saw General Mirza go into exile, and he took over charge as both president and chief marshal administrator. Now, this 1958 was significant, is a significant point in Pakistan's history, because it was expected that in early 1959, Pakistan would have its first general election. But this imposition of martial law aborted that process, that possibility. And what Ayub Khan did in his own time, he framed a constitution in 1962, under which he introduced a political system called basic democracy, through which 80,000 members, or basic Democrats as they were called, 80,000 members, each divided from the two wings of Pakistan. West Pakistan would have 40,000 basic Democrats, East Pakistan would have 40,000 basic Democrats, and these 80,000 people, rather than the entire population of Pakistan, the adult population of Pakistan, these 80,000 people would elect the president of the country and would elect the provincial assemblies, would elect the National Assembly. So that was a blow to democracy. And of course, there were protests at that time. And of course, Ayub Khan couldn't survive those protests. He ruled for a decade, and then he was forced out to a mass, what we call a mass upsurge in both East and West Pakistan. And he went. And then, of course, the 1971 election came. And but before that, Ayub Khan, through his basic Democrats, he got himself formally elected as president in January 1965, when he defeated Miss Fatima Jinnah, the sister of Pakistan's founder, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. So these things have gone on. And then after 1971, the first election that Pakistan, what remained of Pakistan, the West Pakistan, what used to be West Pakistan, but by then had become the remainder of Pakistan, East Pakistan had become Bangladesh. In March 1977, just consider the image. In March 1977, there were two general elections in the subcontinent, in South Asia. One in India, March 1977, when the Congress party, led by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, lost badly and went out of office. In Pakistan, the elections were held under Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, but then the rigging was to an extent where mass protests developed against Mr. Bhutto's government, and eventually it was his own army which forced him out, of course. But before that time, before Mr. Bhutto was overthrown on July 5, 1977, he had apparently reached an agreement with the opposition on conducting new elections, but then that chance never came. In 1988, when Benazir Bhutto succeeded in achieving not a majority, but having a party become the largest single party in the National Assembly, it took days, even weeks, for her to get into office, because the army, Pakistan army, led by General Aslam Beg at that time. Aslam Beg had succeeded General Zia, who died in a crash, in a mysterious plane crash in 1988. Aslam Beg and the president at that time would not agree to hand over power to Benazir Bhutto unless they could get some concessions out of concessions. The concession was that the prime minister would have little or no control over defense or foreign policy in Pakistan. So this thing has gone on, and in recent times, of course, when we come to the present context, now see, we have Imran Khan. We have talked of Imran Khan. Dr. Pervez, Hoodbhoy also talked about him. Now, people like Imran Khan, and even to a very good extent, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, they have all been built up by the army. See, about Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, it said that he was built by the army, he was raised to power by the army, and then he was brought down by the army and eventually executed by the army. In much the same way, people like Imran Khan, they were raised by the army to power, and now that Imran Khan is out of power, he has taken on a populist stance. But we must not forget that Imran Khan was also instrumental in 2013 when he began what we might refer to as container politics. He encouraged his followers to come into containers, to occupy containers, to bring containers to Islamabad in order to force the government of Nawaz Sharif out of office. So now he's out of power, and But then, as has been pointed out already, his concern is not with the fact that the army has taken over, so to say. His concern is with the fact that he has gone out of office. But then he has made mistakes also. When he lost the confidence vote in the assembly, he had his party members, PTI, Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, MNAs, members of the National Assembly, resign. And that was a mistake. So now, if we think that Pakistan, if we consider the fact of how Pakistan can go back to democracy, first of all, Pakistan has never had democracy in that proper sense of the meaning. There are other countries in the region also, but since we are talking about Pakistan, we are sticking to Pakistan. So this issue of Pakistan going back to democracy through elections, that to me seems to be rather far-fetched, because the army will not let go of its authority. And the way the PTI is being dismantled, the way its leading figures are being pressured to leave the party, and they have left the party. Now, this is another curious situation in the country. In the past, also in Pakistan's history, let's say from through the 1950s and 1960s, all the way up to 1971, military rulers put pressure on political leaders, like, for example, the Awami League in what used to be East Pakistan. But then the Awami League stayed intact as a political party. No leaders deserted Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. Later on, after 1971, the People's Party under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in his last stages before he was executed, and then under Benazir Bhutto, and to a certain extent by her mother, Nusrat Bhutto, that was also put under enormous pressure by the likes of General Zia-ul-Haq. But the People's Party survived. It's very few, if at all, of its members deserted the party. But here you have a PTI where its political figures, with its political leaders, have not been able to bear the army's pressure. They've just left Imran Khan in the lurch, and he's all alone. So that when the elections, of course, elections will be held, but what kind of elections will be held? To what extent the Election Commission will be able to establish its authority? Whether that election will be acceptable, that is the question. The army, one can be sure that the army will not let go of its hold on politics. Thank you.
So thank you so much for that fantastically contextual and encapsulating précis. Nothing substantive seems to have changed to bring Pakistan into a sort of modern age where things happen. But the Pakistani leaders at the moment, whoever they represent, the army, civil society, well, civil society we know, or the political elite, do they see this as a disastrous journey that you just described, or do they justify it?
The people who are in office today?
Yes, the people that you and your colleagues talk to. Do they see this as a disaster?
The politicians who hold office in Pakistan say they are in office, but they are not in power. So obviously, they would like to have a situation created through which they can be elected to office. Now they're more or less an interim government. But I think, as one of our participants pointed out, this government may last a few months, maybe a year, but then behind this government there will always be the army. See, without the Pakistan army, so far, politics has not progressed, or if I say politics has always regressed. So that's the situation.
And is it just finally, what are the repercussions of this? And do you agree that Pakistan is descending into anarchy?
Well, I wouldn't go to that extent to say that Pakistan is descending into anarchy, because see, we can derive some kind of hope, some kind of optimism from the movement which Imran Khan's followers have put up after his arrest. Now his followers have now been silenced, as has Imran Khan himself been silenced. But this is a temporary situation. I think the army has also become conscious of its limitations, because for the first time in Pakistan's history, if you leave out East Pakistan or Bangladesh, that was a different case altogether. Bengalis rebelled against the Pakistan army. But within Pakistan itself, there's for the first time that the civilian population has erupted in anger. The army will keep that in mind, even if it goes for a military trial of Imran Khan and his PTI people. But the army will from now on will now bear in mind the fact that it cannot go on taking a position against the people.
Thank you for that, because that your last thought merges beautifully into our final panelist. The debate is going to continue after that, though. Tim Willasey-Wilsey is visiting professor at King's College London and a former diplomat posted to Pakistan. He is going to explain how the army is far less comfortable in this crisis as would appear. Tim Willasey-Wilsey, tell us what you know.
Thanks very much. Well, military coups are usually mounted to remove sitting governments. The events of Pakistan of 9th of May and since have been designed to prevent a former Prime Minister, Imran Khan, and his opposition party from contesting the election. So here we are, a big difference. This is the army acting against an opposition party, not against the government. In fact, we still have a democratic government in charge in Islamabad. Of course, 9th of May played into the army's hands, in particular that image of the Corps Commander's residence in Lahore in flames, which would have infuriated the army. Imran was able to give an interview to Newsweek the day after the 9th of May. Actually, there's quite a lot of good sense in the interview, but he did continue to peddle this conspiracy theory about the so-called cipher telegram and the allegations that the United States were trying to oust him. Now, you know, this is pretty irresponsible stuff, because Imran knows perfectly well that the cipher telegram was not a coup against him. But he's played this, as he does, as a populist leader, which he is. He plays it to his base to whip up support for himself. Interesting, therefore, to think why the international community has not been outraged at the army's clampdown on the PTI and Imran Khan. I think there are a couple of reasons. Firstly, the one I've mentioned already, there is a functioning civilian-led government in Pakistan. So this isn't a coup, this is an action against an opposition party. Secondly, Pakistan is a seriously important country. People, very, very young country. I think average age is something like 26. It's extraordinary. A country with nuclear weapons. And you know, viewing Pakistan from the outside, the fact that there is an army in charge there, in charge of the nuclear weapons, and therefore there's no obvious sign of fragmentation of Pakistan happening at the moment, like there has been at several times during its history. And you know, and if you're worried about the security of nuclear weapons, or even if you're Modi in India, worrying about the security of your northwestern neighbor, the fact the Pakistan army is still a credible, coherent force is actually important. So I think what the army's plan is, as somebody has already said, is they will hold the elections. And incidentally, there's an important point here, I think, about Pakistan. A lot of people have talked about the inadequacy of Pakistan's democracy, but since 1947, Pakistan has always thought of itself as a democracy. And each time the army takes power, the plan is to return it back to civilian government. I think that's something we need to hold on to. There's an instinctive nature of Pakistani democracy, which, you know, in spite of all the gloom and doom that we've heard on this call already, I think is something to hold on to and to be positive about. So the elections will take place. The current government will win, of course. PTI probably won't stand as a party, and I don't think Imran Khan will probably be allowed to stand. I think there is a plan to replace the current government with the current leaders with the new generation. So that's Bilawal Bhutto Zardari, Benazir's eldest son, and I think possibly even Mariam Nawaz Sharif's daughter. So I think, you know, the new government will be portrayed as a new government. But the truth of the matter is, as we all know, it won't be real democracy, and everyone knows it. Imran Khan is by far the most popular politician in the country. Bilawal and Mariam may be new faces, but the old semi-feudal political system will still be in place. And in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, worryingly, the army's ally is Maulana Fazlur Rahman, and I fear that he will take KP province in a much more obscurantist direction, much more akin to Taliban Afghanistan than to a modern state, which Pakistan rightly expects to be. The bigger issue, of course, is the economy, 37% inflation, people really, really struggling to make ends meet. And this will surely be reflected in popular action at some point. So this is where I think the army will begin to worry. You know, when you get a state of very, very large crowds out on the street protesting because of the financial economic situation, you know, what does the army do? And the army's been in this position before of being ordered to fire on crowds and stuff, and it doesn't like it. The army, the Pakistan army, likes being popular. It sees itself as the guarantor of Pakistan's nationhood and does not see itself as an unpopular institution. But the truth of the matter is it has become unpopular. It partly blames Imran Khan for his populist comments, for his anti-army stand, which you know he often takes. And as I think Pervez Hoodbhoy said, he's often been a tactless leader. Asim Munir is a new chief of army staff. He's not very experienced. He's not like Kiani was or Rahil Sharif or Bajwa. He's new, and there's a couple of worrying aspects of developments within the Pakistan army. Certainly when I lived in Pakistan and in the previous years, the chief of army staff was primus inter pares. He was the leader amongst the corps commanders. But the corps commanders conference was a seriously almost quasi-democratic institution. To give you an example, the first corps commanders conference after 9/11 attacks, Musharraf says in his own autobiography, he got a lot of opposition from corps commanders in that meeting and only narrowly won out as the chief of army staff. That seems to have gone in Pakistan. The Pakistan army chief now seems to be totally dominant in the corps commanders conference, which means that he's not able to listen to wiser heads or more experienced heads who can sort of suggest that he operates in a different way. I think there's another interesting thing about the Pakistan, which is the Pakistan army, which is the demographics have changed. Even when I lived in Pakistan in the 1990s, the sons of the Islamabad, Lahore, and Karachi elites would go into the army and would find their way up and would become majors and colonels and eventually generals. So you had a sort of upper middle class, the same class as the political class and the business class in the Pakistan army. That's no longer the case. Those people don't go, they go to university in the United States and UK, they go abroad now. They don't serve in the Pakistan army. So the Pakistan army is now, the officer corps is a different demographic from the political class. And I think that there is a danger in my mind that leads to an antagonistic relationship towards politicians and an antagonistic relationship towards the people. And I think there's a real worry in my mind that in the medium term, the Pakistan army stops becoming the sort of guarantor of Pakistan nationhood, which is what it is or what it has been, and becomes something altogether more hostile, something more like Burma or Syria or Algeria. And I think, you know, medium term, that is a source of concern.
Thank you for leaving us with that. It's a bit of an edge of your seat page turner, that one, and you've gone through at the end very brilliantly, I think, saying how the actual class of officer is changing in the Pakistan army, and that as guarantors of the nation, they could end up like the junta in Burma or something like that. I just want to go back before I want you to expand on that in a moment, but if you could go back with it was what Pervez Hoodbhoy said at the beginning about Imran Khan, that he was naive and over innocent perhaps and tactless dealing with the army, the Taliban and America. Is not the point of democracy in a way that perhaps an outsider does get elected, but the institutions are strong enough to ensure that his personal naivety doesn't impact on the country?
That's a fascinating one. So, you know, let's think about Donald Trump. that was an interesting case, of a man who won power, and the theory was that the Washington elite would hold him in check, and the Washington elite was unable to hold him in check. And it seems to me, this is a structural problem we have at the moment, for whatever the reasons are that we now have a range of populist leaders around the world. They divide into two categories. You've got the smart ones who know how to act, like Narendra Modi and Erdogan. I mean, they may not be particularly attractive, but they are smart. And then you have, the Bolsonaros, the Trumps, the Boris Johnsons, and you have Imran Khan. And now Imran Khan, Imran Khan has always been a populist. He's never been the brightest of people. He's very charismatic in many ways. He's a famous cricketer. But if you look at his record, and I thought Pervez Hoodbhoy was absolutely right, what he said to him, his indiscretion about calling bin Laden a martyr, his indiscretion about the Taliban, what Imran sees as openness, other people see as irritating comments and offensive comments. So, he's created quite a bit of the animosity that has now ranged against him. And I think that's part of the problem. But I think, Humphrey, you're right. This problem of what we do about these populist leaders who we elect, but then become a problem, and that the sort of state mechanisms fail to control them, I think is a real problem. And just finally, this scenario you painted of a different style of Pakistan army with a different character or class of officer, and then the Burma and Syria things. Can you expand on that a bit? Yeah, I mean, I knew very well a man called Brigadier Niaz, who was probably better known to most people as an advisor to President Musharraf. And when he was a much younger officer, he was given orders. This is under the Bhutto regime. He was given orders to fire on a crowd in Lahore, and he refused to fire, as did one other brother officer, I think. And as a result of that, he was dismissed from the army, but sort of achieved sort of hero status. Here was a man, a Pakistan army officer, who refused to fire on the crowd. And he became sufficiently popular that Pervez Musharraf was happy to have him as his previous advisor. You've got to be a person of some substance to make a decision like that, and possibly even have a little bit of personal family wealth to, take the fact that you're going to lose your job as a Pakistan army officer. Now, the question is, and I don't know the answer to this, but the new breed of Pakistan army officer, no longer from the middle class and the upper middle class, but from the lower middle class, do they have that sort of culture that gives them, the ability to turn down an unpopular order, for example?
That is a very good point. I'm going to give you a question from Philip Bowman that introduces China into this, and then I would like to go around the panel with the same question or the same issue. Philip Bowman's exact question is, why does the panel believe China has stayed silent on the military crackdown and the ousting of Khan? We've touched on this a bit, but what could or is China's role in all of this?
Well, I think that's a relatively easy one. I mean, China's not interested in democracy. I mean, for very obvious reasons. If you're China, the only organization that really matters in Pakistan is the army. And why is China particularly concerned about Pakistan at the moment? It's particularly concerned about what it calls the East Turkestan group, which is inside Afghanistan. Actually, a significant number of Uyghur militants inside Afghanistan. And the Pakistanis had said to China, don't worry, when we get our guys in power in Kabul, we'll be able to deliver all these terrorists back to you. So, the idea is the Uyghurs would be delivered back to China and the Pakistan terrorists would be delivered back to Pakistan. What happened when the Taliban got into power in Kabul is they said, well, we're not going to deliver on any of that. And so the Uyghurs are perfectly safe inside Afghanistan, as indeed are the Pakistani terrorist groups. So you know, if you're China, you want to stay close to the army and sort out this major problem.
Right. That goes into two questions, which I'd like to bring in Pervez Hoodbhoy now. Thank you, Tim. Willasey-Wilsey, we'll come back to you for a final repercussions answer, I hope, towards the end. But Pervez Hoodbhoy, give us your angle on the China element and also the things that Tim mentioned that have come up in questions here. Uddhabadai says, in the light of America's Pakistan fatigue, what can be done to quash the rising tide of militancy? And there's a question here from Rinjin Sud, to what degree are charges of terrorism against Khan politically motivated? How much is terrorism playing into all this, and what is China's role in the future of Pakistan?
Well, China will deal the military because that's the easiest thing for it to deal with. And certainly they don't have much concern for what happens to democracy in Pakistan. What China is concerned about, however, is that CPEC has been considerably derailed, that it has now China's put in $60 billion so far, and Pakistan owes China $30 billion and is not able to repay its debt, and so there is now talk about.
Just to clarify, is the Belt and Road Initiative Pakistan corridor, isn't it, coming up from Gwadar?
That's correct.
Yeah.
The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor.
Yeah.
Now that hasn't worked out too well. Gwadar has not become a port with any significant amount of commercial activity. I was present over there just some months ago, and there's barely a ship every 2 days that comes by. It was supposed to be very different from that, but it hasn't worked out. Well, coming back to China, China is now not willing to give a blank check to Pakistan as Pakistan thought it would. It is concerned about Pakistan's financial situation, but also its internal political situation, which now nobody seems to be able to predict as to what will happen next on that. We know that China's interest in Pakistan has been primarily strategic, and that is certainly going to be present for a very long time, but China's interest now has shifted towards Taiwan, and there Pakistan cannot be very useful to it. And so Pakistan's expectation that China would take up the slack with the departure of the Americans is not going to be fulfilled.
But China also, I think. So just to nail down, China also doesn't want the scenario that Tim mentioned about coming into a sort of Burmese-style, Myanmar-style dictatorship, or porous borders whereby insurgents can seep up into Xinjiang.
Yes, I think that Pakistan now, well, first of all, I don't know, I really don't know the extent to which the Uyghurs are present in Pakistan or in Afghanistan. I suppose they must be there, but Pakistan is completely silent about that, and we don't have any actual data from the ground on that. As far as the sheltering of terrorists by the Afghan government is concerned, I absolutely agree. The Taliban are certainly not going to crack down on either Al-Qaeda or the TTP. In fact, the TTP continues to have sanctuaries over there in spite of the visit of the Pakistani foreign ministers, I should say, and repeated pleading that the TTP should be expelled from Afghanistan. Their attacks are continuing by the day, and that's creating a situation of destabilization in the border areas with Afghanistan. So,
Pervez Hoodbhoy, thank you so much for that. Dr. Harlan Ullman, China's role, and give us a thought on militancy in Pakistan as well. Harlan Ullman? Harlan Ullman has...
China's role is going to be, I think, minimal. Military sales, supporting the military, and as a potential counterweight to India. but the focus really is now on the Middle East and the Gulf in particular. China is much more concerned about expanding markets. As you know, it's got a naval base establishing in the Gulf region. What it's done to arrange a limited peace between Saudi Arabia and Iran is quite remarkable. So I think Pakistan is taking a back seat. I would like to shift the conversation a little bit to the military, however, because for a while, it seemed that the military was increasingly inhabited by people with beards. But I have been informed, though I don't know, that the military is going back, I think, to a more traditional role. Its education inside the United States has been greatly hampered and reduced. I don't know what the situation is with Britain. And so I really am curious about what the culture of the Pakistani military is. I don't think, however, that the Pakistani military, as Tim suggested, is liable to form a junta akin to Syria, some other place. In my experience, General Kiani and General Pasha, who was ISI, as you know, and this is more than 10 years ago, were not very favorably impressed privately with the politicians and said so to me. But as you know, one aspect of the Pakistani military is that they are exceedingly polite and civil, no matter what their feelings are. So I'm not sure that Tim is right. He knows probably more than I. So I raised the question, is there really a chance of militancy affecting the Pakistani military more serious now? The other point I'd make is that when General Kiani was trying to take over much of Pakistan, he had a very competent Lieutenant General, Corps Commander, who was becoming the Minister of Education. And this poor guy threw his hands up because he couldn't deal with the educational system. He couldn't deal with all the religious schools. And so it really never worked out. And so in that case, the military understands that it's somewhat limited in what it can do in the civil sector. But on the other hand, I think it's pretty obvious from what the other panelists have said, for the time being, the saving grace, if there is one, has got to be military intervention. But that's rather akin to somebody who's jumped off the top floor of the Empire State Building, cruising past floor 56 and asked, how's it going? And the response was, so far, so good. So this is only a short-term response. And the long-term, as I said earlier, I wish I had a better solution, but I don't.
Well, the long-term response we've heard so far is from Dr. Sumrin Kalia. But Sumrin, tell us the China factor, good or bad for civil society? Militancy, how does civil society deal with that?
Well, the China factor is like, it's not a part of the general society. It's still very much engaged only with the Pakistani military. There is a kind of not a very welcoming attitude amongst Pakistanis. I mean, it seems like Pakistanis have a very strong association with China, but on the ground, I don't really see that so much. At least in Karachi, people are wary of the Chinese. A lot of people actually think they're the new form of colonialists. So I don't see them being able to really penetrate into the Pakistani civil society the way US has been able to do in some ways, because of the way it engages with the universities and, you know, through the US aid and all. It's not so in the case of China.
And as far as the militancy element goes, or the scenario that Tim laid out of the army becoming a sort of Myanmar-style junta, do you buy that?
Well, what I've been recently hearing is that there is a division within the army regarding Imran Khan's issue. There are certain sentiments which are pro-Imran Khan within the military. And amongst those who are pro-Imran Khan, what I've heard are the ones who are more on the religious side. You know, the lower middle class who have had a little bit of more religious influence in their education. So that does kind of sound a little bit alarming.
Yeah. Okay. That's thank you so much for that. Aside Badrul Hassan, the China element, you are knowledgeable about Bangladesh as well, so you've had that there. How is that going to impact on Pakistan's future?
I think the Chinese, China will have a very long impact on Pakistan, as also the rest of the region, including Bangladesh, because the Chinese, the Pakistani military and the Bangladesh military both are dependent on China for military supplies to a very large extent. And as far as China's role or China's place in Pakistan's politics is concerned, I think China has been a very pivotal player in Pakistan's politics since the 1960s, since the early 1960s, when there was a shift away from such organization, a shift away on the part of Pakistan from such Western-oriented organizations as SEATO and CENTO and towards China. Yes. So that is point one. And second thing is Pakistan, as far your earlier question was why isn't it saying anything or interested in intervening or giving us opinion on situation in Pakistan right now. So the fact remains that the Chinese have always maintained that stance in every country they're developing interest in. I'll just end on one note, and that is in 1971, when the war between Bangladesh, the Bangladesh Liberation War, and the Pakistan army that was going on, the Chinese knew what was happening and in Bangladesh or East Pakistan at that time, but the Chinese preferred to maintain silence. But after that, once Bangladesh came into being, they originally vetoed Bangladesh's attempts to enter the United Nations, but by 1974 they came round to the fact that Bangladesh was an independent state, and now China and Bangladesh enjoy very warm relations as Pakistan and China enjoy warm relations.
Can I just ask you very quickly, is the character makeup of the officer class of the Bangladesh military changing in the way that we've heard the Pakistan's has been?
In the early years of Bangladesh's existence, we had this officer corps, which was actually a throwback to Pakistan. They were all our officers, military officers.
Part of the elite. They were the political
part
elite.
Of the elite. Well. They're part of the elite, and they were all officers with backgrounds in the Pakistan army. They had all joined the Pakistan army, but then they left. They deserted the Pakistan, went to the war. But now, since that time, since 1975, in fact, we have had a new elite class of military officers in Pakistan, and they have. The good thing is, since for decades now, the army has not interfered or intervened in national politics. Though there are questions about the army playing leading roles in such areas as the industry, the economy. Retired military officers are put in charge of civilian organizations like the Water and Sewerage Development Authority and other organizations. So that these things raise questions, but they have stayed that way. They've not moved beyond.
No interference as we've seen in Pakistan. I want to ask you to give me a 2 or 3 word answer, which is our debate, which is the repercussion of Pakistan's descent into anarchy. I just want to go around the whole panel doing this, starting with you, Saeed. The repercussions in a couple of words.
The repercussions, if Pakistan descends into anarchy, that will affect the entire region. By the entire region, I mean South Asia, especially these 3 countries, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Tim Willasey-Wilsey, the repercussions, what are they? Tim has gone. Okay, Pervez, give us 3 words. Pervez Hoodbhoy.
More misery for the people.
Dr. Harlan Ullman.
We don't need that to happen.
Okay, that's we don't need that to happen. This is still dropping off the Empire State Building. Dr. Sumrin Kalia, 3 words on repercussions.
The poor will continue to suffer, and they will suffer even more. It's more about the poor.
About the poor. Very, very good one. Tim, you are back. 3 words on repercussions, and you've gone again. Tim, are you with us? It fears not that Tim is not with us. So now is the time as we draw to the end. Sorry to miss you there, Tim. One last chance. No. Now's the time as we draw to the end of our Democracy Forum debate to bring in the assessment of our chair, Barry Gardiner, MP, a veteran of political upheavals, both home and abroad, where prime ministers are thrown out mid-term, and he's deeply knowledgeable about Pakistan. Barry, what do you make of our discussion?
Humphrey, thank you very much. I mean, you talk about prime ministers getting thrown out mid-term. Of course, this afternoon, the parliament here has been debating a former prime minister who was thrown out mid-term, actually throwing himself out of parliament. So I've been missing that fun, but I've had much joy listening to our panel this afternoon. Let me try and do a run through. Charles spoke of really this long-term failure to operate as a functioning democracy. He said that the forthcoming elections in September were unlikely to be free and fair. He went into the business with Imran Khan and the Supreme Court overruling the arrest, but the government then condemning the judgment. He said that Pakistan's future will be decided by who wins between Khan and the military, and that the military obviously orchestrated Khan's arrest and to a certain extent the downfall. And he spoke of three challenges. The fact that the judiciary, the legislature, and the military were in conflict, rampant terrorism, and inflation and debt, the economic crisis. 70% chance, he said, of the PDM probably retaining power, 20% the judiciary declaring the election rigged, and Khan innocent. We then came to Dr. Hoodbhoy, Pervez Hoodbhoy, who I've enjoyed listening to on many previous occasions and again today. Went to the heart of it, actually, when he spoke of Khan paying the price for his own arrogance, and that he'd come to power with the support of the army and his support of Taliban and his hatred for India. Talked about him hosting the TLP, demanding severance of relations with France, and the rather jejune missteps which he has made as a political leader because of his unwise populism. He said that things may have now stabilized, but that economic catastrophe awaits. To a certain extent, he said, and Dr. Kalia agreed, I think, when she also backed up the fact that life to a certain extent is back to normal. The army is in charge, a former prime minister is being accused of corruption, and the economy is in chaos. And you, in your subsequent questioning, Humphrey, said, well, goodness me, that's some form of normality. If that's what's normal, then it's really a dire state of chaos. He failed to attack the army for its own corruption, was the point that Pervez made. Khan, in attacking the army, was really only trying to protect himself and blamed them for the attack on him. He wasn't actually making what should have been the incisive attack upon the way in which the ISI and the army, the military in Pakistan, has corrupted the whole of the polity all the way through Pakistan's existence. And he spoke of the vast business interests that the army has, and the need to perpetuate the war economy, that war economy that keeps the army as powerful as it is. Harlan Ullman spoke of the times when assassinations were rife and the days of General Musharraf. He talked about the feudal system, how power and economic power were concentrated really in the hands of a very few families, and said the country simply cannot repay its debts. The US has now turned its engagement away from Pakistan to India and the Quad. When questioned on the role of China, I'm not sure where he was on that, actually, but I think it's an interesting question as to how China, and again, you came back at this when you asked our panelists at the end. He was very clear, though, on nuclear security, and when challenged, he gave good grounds for that in terms of the tripartite lock on the system. And critically, I think, said there was no desire on the part of the army to have an external crisis, given the disintegrating nature of the economy. Again, re-emphasized the fact that the USA is really no longer interested, and it would seem no one else is either. Said that China and Ukraine had taken up all the US's airspace, in effect, and that I think his final remark was that Pakistan as a polity was at the point of no return. Dr. Kalia said that civil society is vibrant, and she clearly sees this as an area of hope, an area of possibility, and said how the protests were exerting influence. She said they don't support Khan as he did not invest in civil society. So in a sense, I felt that was a bit having one's cake and eat it, because they are protesting about what's happened to him, but they don't actually necessarily support him and all that he has stood for. I thought it was very perceptive when she said his politics were mainly theatrics. She spoke about the PPP in Karachi jailing Jamal al-Islamia, sorry, excuse my tongue-tiedness, even though they had more support. And this way in which really democracy, civil society and democracy sit very uneasily together. She mentioned 3 solutions, but I'm afraid I only caught 2 of them. One was the economic reform that was necessary at a local level. The other was the leaders needing to develop democratic civility. And I found that a very interesting point, because I feel that it's one which I certainly imagine is the case within Pakistan, but I think it's much, much wider than that. I think it's the case in the US. I think it's the case in the UK. Our politicians, our leaders have lost the ability to treat each other with that democratic civility. Not to imply that because one disagrees, the other person is necessarily evil and corrupt. And I think it's important that that sense of respect comes back into politics across the world. She was very clear that the army is not a long-term solution. It may be able to stabilize the process from time to time, but it's not the way forward. Said Badrullah Khan really gave us a magisterial lesson in the history. Pointed out that in 71, the army refused to accept the election results, the first general election, breaking up the country, 9 years to get a constitution, lasting 2 years before martial law. Spoke of the power given to what is an incredibly small number of people, the 80,000 that he spoke of, to determine who should be in power. Spoke of the 77 Indira Gandhi losing in an India the democratic will, Bhutto's rigged election in the same year. He made the point that the army will not let go of its hold on politics, and said Pakistan is not descending into anarchy. He had hope in Khan's followers and thinks the army realizes it can't keep taking a position against the people. Now, Tim Willasey-Wilsey, fascinating point. Not a coup, he said. The army is against the opposition, Khan, and it's not a coup because they're actually against the opposition. Now, I would really like to engage with Tim on this, because is it not worse than a coup? Because what's happening is a complete undermining of due process. The very possibility of opposition being destroyed in that way, that is fundamental to the organization of any democracy. Whether you like the opposition or you don't like the opposition, where you think that their analysis of what's wrong with the country is correct or not, the very fact that the army is destroying the capacity to have that democratic dialogue, I think is deeply, deeply worrying. And he said the army plan to hold the election, and each time the army takes power, it's with a view to handing back to democracy. Now, I have to say, this took me back to Robert Bolt. I'm sure many of you will remember that wonderful play, A Man for All Seasons, where there is the again, very similar situation here. You have the fundamental challenge of a religious state, and where Thomas More is challenging Roper and says, so now you give Roper says, so now you give the devil the benefit of law. And Moore replies, yes, what would you do? Cut a great road through the law to get after the devil? Roper says, yes, I'd cut down every law in England to do that. And that's when Moore delivers what is the wonderful speech in the whole play. And he says, oh, and when the last law was down and the devil turned round on you, where would you hide, Roper? The laws all being flat. This country is planted thick with laws from coast to coast, man's laws and God's. And if you cut them down, and you're just the man to do it, do you really think you could stand upright in the winds that would blow then? And it seems to me that that's the position that Pakistan is in. It's where the laws, the democratic norms are lost, and the winds are blowing around, and it's not clear that anyone is going to be able to stand. I'll leave it there.
Barry, thank you very much for that telling Man for All Seasons comparison that you gave us. But before we close, given that you might be the ruling party of our great nation soon, and you've just seen a populist prime minister get voted out of Parliament, the repercussions that we're talking of in Pakistan that we've heard from Harlan, militancy, nuclear weapons and all of that, do we in Britain have the bandwidth or any influence to do anything about it?
I wish any of our leading politicians were focused in a serious way on the implications of an unjust world. I remember David Blunkett when he was at the Home Office. On his wall, I was a PPS in the Home Office when he was there, and on his wall he had it was a painting, but it was of an Arabic script. And I asked him what it said. and it said, if you want peace, create justice. If you want justice, live sustainably. And it seems to me that we have lost in our political thinking the ability to understand that poverty and injustice leads to conflict, and it leads to a dysfunctional polity. And I think I'm right, I hope I'm right, Sumrin, in saying that that was one of the central points that you were making in what you said. And certainly in the summing up, two of our speakers said, more misery for the people was one, poor will continue to suffer was the other. And sadly, I don't believe that our leaders in the UK are sufficiently focused and fixated on those connections. We are very, very focused on the Ukraine war, a war in Europe, quite right that we should be. But we haven't begun to understand why other parts of the world, they don't see that conflict in the same way that we do, why they see different forms of colonialism in the way in which we approach them. And I think we've lost, in many respects, the sort of politicians who can think globally. And I think that's very sad for all our polity.
Thank you. Another sobering thought from this sobering debate that we've had, and a couple of comments in that Dr. Harlan Ullman has written. Actually, Thomas More applies more to the US. He also says that his particular point was that Pakistan is secondary or tertiary for China now. It seems to be for most of the world. For that question that came in about the multinational institutions. And Tim Willasey-Wilsey, who we lost on that final point about repercussions, says that his point was not the Pakistan army will become like Burma, but that they fear becoming unpopular and acting against the crowd, which could lead to an antagonistic relationship with the people, as in Burma or in Syria. From being the protectors, they become the oppressors, and that is it. Thank you. We are out of time. Read more about all these issues and much more in our sister magazine, Asian Affairs, if anybody can see that. In the latest issue, we delve into the G7 and the Global South, and much insight there too into Pakistan. Join us, please, for our next Democracy Forum debate, which is Wednesday, July the 26th, at China's growing inroads into South Asia. And thank you to our panel, Pervez Hoodbhoy, Harlan Ullman, Sumrin Halia, Saeed Badrul Ahsan, Tim Willasey-Wilsey, Barry Gardiner for your insightful close, and Lord Charles Bruce, thank you for so skillfully outlining our backdrop. From me, Humphrey Hawksley, and the team at Asian Affairs and the Democracy Forum, thank you for being here, and until next month, goodbye.